Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar topic, Adapting with Purpose and Communicating with Confidence, Financial Strategy for California's Changing Education Landscape. My name is James Collins. I'm the Senior Director of Business Development here at CSBA, and I will be facilitating today's webinar. We'll be recording today's webinar, and everyone will receive a link to the recording. So if you have any questions for our panelists during this time, please submit it during using the Q&A button, not the chat function. We will go through all your questions at the end of the webinar. If you have any questions after the close of the webinar, you can always email us at csba@csba.org. At this time, I would like to introduce our presenters for today's discussion, Jeff Pezel, Senior Director, Education Leadership Strategy, and Tyler Hall, Solution Strategy. And at this time, I will turn it over to you, Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you, James. It's a great pleasure to be here with you all today. And again, Jeff Pelzel, Senior Director of Education Leadership Strategy, probably most relevant to you on the call here, 28 years in public education. And my prior role to joining PowerSchool just over almost 3 years ago, I was actually a superintendent in Southern California in the New Hall School District. And my role now is a bridge between what goes on in the school districts and what happens with our solution. So pleasure to be here. Tyler, can you introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, thanks for that, Jeff. Hey, everyone, I'm Tyler Hall, Solution Strategy Director here at PowerSchool with Resource Planning. So I've spent a little over 11 years, not quite as much as Jeff's tenured experience at 28 in K-12. And that started off in a budget office in a 21,000 student district. So I manage budget for all of our buildings, all of our academic departments, as well as schools. And we thought really critically around how to communicate our finances out to not only internal constituents, so our superintendent's cabinet, our superintendent's leadership team from a teacher's perspective, but really making sure that everyone in the community was also on board with the decisions that we were making during budget. So really excited to talk with you all today a little bit more about how do we really adapt with purpose in the current constraints that we're dealing with, and ultimately how do we effectively communicate our message so that we're telling a meaningful story for really everyone in the broader community as well as internally within our organization. We're really looking forward to kicking this off, Jeff.
Thanks, Tyler. And so here's what to expect for today's webinar. We're going to talk about the financial landscape. In California, we're going to talk about what is budgeting, what is a resource allocation plan, and the optics of budget. When I think about when I was a superintendent, I'll just say this solution, Allovue, that we're going to be talking about, really to me it's a unicorn solution. There is no other solution like it out there. And I think about the ability to have this transparency, not only within your school district, for you as school board members, the community as a whole. I hope that's what you take away from this, is really that opportunity to really be smart about what you're doing and be transparent in this process. And so, Tyler, I'm going to let you take it over from here as we're going to dig in deeper.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And so I think probably the biggest thing to think about from a financial landscape perspective, right, depending on where you're at in your budget cycle, where we're interacting with the public, how we're really thinking about finances going forward. Sometimes it might feel like the glass isn't even half empty, it's broken. And really what we want to sort of triangulate around are what are those things that are currently affecting us from a district lens. So I think really the biggest one that's at top of mind for really any number of districts is what's happening from an enrollment trend perspective. What does it look like specifically in California as we start looking at attendance rates? And ultimately, how do we then start layering on those additional complexities around some of our current constraints and what's affecting us? So whether that be existing state funding policies, so what's going on from an LCFF perspective, how are we dealing with things like increasing costs? How are we dealing with competition within the market for effective teachers? And then ultimately, how are we dealing with the continued rise of charters and privates? And how does that ultimately impact us from a public school district lens or traditional K-12 model to really make sure that we're setting ourselves up for success as we're, again, dealing with sort of this varying degrees of issues across the board. And then to layer on the current uncertainty around federal funding. So what's going to happen as we continue to progress throughout the upcoming years, and ultimately what's that going to do to the stability of some of the funding that we rely on as districts to help make sure we're impacting those most neediest kids. And Jeff, I've got the finance lens. I live and breathe accounts and amounts and numbers every day. But I think, from your opportunity to getting to talk with superintendents really across the country today, what are some of the things that are top of mind for you as we look at some of the budget pressures that are affecting us?
Well, I mean, I think in California in particular, I know in my school district, the enrollment challenge, declining enrollment was definitely an issue. I mean, I can remember when I entered as an assistant superintendent to the time at which I left as a superintendent, we went from, I would say about 6,700 students to 5,900. So that's a significant decline. And then you're dealing with challenges of ADA, being an ADA state and the funding with that. And then the nuances of where the state funding is coming out, and we're doing a lot more of this one-time funding source, these grants and those kind of things. And so trying to be strategic about what that looks like. And most importantly, I think what I keep hearing is how are we able to tie that back to the LCAP and honestly our strategic plan goals that we have moving forward.
Yeah, and I think that can pose a number of issues, especially when you talk about how do we braid funding and sort of piecemeal an operating budget together as we're dealing with all of this uncertainty, and to then start to be able to think long term beyond just, making sure that we're balanced for next year, but ultimately, really, how do we make sure that we're meaningfully affecting change and being able to implement those plans with fidelity beyond just getting to that balanced budget in year one and then looking beyond. But I think really what we want to do is start to frame really at a high level those pieces that are affecting us the most. And so when we look at national enrollment trends currently, NCES is projecting approximately an 8% enrollment decline nationally by the year 2031. When we look specifically at California, the California Department of Finance is projecting a 10% decrease by 2034. So we know that not only is an enrollment uncertainty a certainty, but also we're dealing with some pretty rapid rates of decline. And those do vary from county to county or district to district. But even at a county level, what we do know is that even as enrollment has continued to decline, in those areas, we know that the students that remain typically have higher needs. And I'm just wondering from your perspective there, as we talk about the loss of students, how that impacts state aid and funding formula, and then ultimately what that does from a resource perspective, some of your thoughts there.
Well, I mean, I think obviously declining enrollment means less funding, but I think what's interesting is coming out of the pandemic and we're 5+ years removed, what you see is an increase in behavioral challenges. So you're looking at additional supports, more kids potentially qualifying for special education, needing more intensive services, adding social workers, some personnel that you didn't necessarily have full-time, maybe even full-time counselors. When you have elementary schools, you might have had them shared between buildings and now you're needing them full-time. So I think that's the interesting nuance here. I mean, we are declining enrollment, but our needs based upon the needs of students, families, and even your staff, when you think about some of the needs that they have, those things are growing, which is not a good recipe when you have less dollars coming in and you need to spend more money on the output.
Yeah, so it's again doing less with less, however
Yep.
way you want to phrase it, we're continually strained. And I think even if you were to bring it down to another level, even from within a district, when we look at some of those enrollment trends, while it might show a homogeneous decline across the United States or that 10% projected decline within California itself, when we start to look at an individual district level, the nuances associated with some of those enrollment fluctuations become far more nuanced. So when we know that maybe district enrollment's declining, so where I was, we went from 21,000 students down to about 19,000 in the span of less than 5 years, and that was pre-pandemic numbers. We know that there's a lot of variation from building to building. So those declines aren't necessarily uniform across the district, and it really affects how we're able to tell that story around enrollment, because there might be some areas where we need to talk about maybe adding a new elementary, and there are others where we've got less than 200 kids or at less than 50% capacity at some of our buildings. So there's challenges associated with even just the geographical spread of our students within a district itself. And especially in California, when we know about school choice and we know how enrollment can fluctuate, even if we look at some of those attendance areas within a school, we know that those kids might be geographically spread in buildings across our district. So it makes us really hard to sort of project and think about how do those student loads affect ultimately things like our staffing. We also know that we're competing for kids. So between choice, charters, and that mobility we've added, enrollment isn't necessarily guaranteed. And the things that we've traditionally done from a forecasting perspective might not necessarily reflect reality, especially as we look at what some of the things that have happened this year. And on top of that, when we start to talk about innovating or doing new things, or adding maybe new additional CTE pathways or creating magnet opportunities, do we fall back on building those programs out where there is space available? Or are we thinking about how do we really isolate the kids that need the most, and how do we build resources and supports around those? And again, when we're focused on just balancing our budget for next year, it makes it really hard for us to account for all of these different variables and all the noise in the data to really make sense of it, to create some data informed decisions or strategic frameworks to make those decisions within the district. I'm curious if there's anything you'd like to add from your perspective, even just from some of that intra-district variability.
Well, I mean, I think the interesting thing is, you have sort of this optimal size, I think. Newhall's an elementary district. So, we had schools that were operating under 400, 350, and then you ultimately end up with these challenges of a lot of combo classes. How do you right size those supports? And then the most difficult decision ever for, I'm certain, for a superintendent and a school board is considering closing schools, and that's something you don't want to do. So how do you optimize what you have going on, and then figure out where those programs should be placed, so that you can sustain what you have. But at some point, potentially, you do have to start looking at, maybe it is time to look at closing some schools.
Yeah, and I think as you look at sort of what we were able to do, utilizing ESSER funds to continue to buoy maybe some buildings or programs or initiatives that we didn't necessarily have the normal operating budget to support, we were able to sort of get away with maybe avoiding some of those difficult conversations. And so while there was a lot of focus a few years ago about just how big is that ESSER cliff going to be, we're now at another point where it becomes that same conversation. As we start to lose kids, as we start to have more variability in where they're placed, what does that do if we're trying to push forward and do anything new or innovative as a district outside of just balancing our budget and maintaining status quo? And that's where I think what probably is one of the more basic components, but I think it's always really important to highlight and hit on and understand, is really what is a budget? And again, I'm a numbers guy, I'm a finance nerd, but if we think about what a budget plan actually is, it estimates our proposed expenses for a school year and the proposed means for paying for those expenses. So our expenses should generally always equal revenue, and we need to understand explicitly what are we going to buy and how are we going to pay for it. And from a traditional finance view, it's accounts and amounts, it's dollars and cents. We need to be conservative, and we need to always be projecting to add to fund balance or to stay in the black. But really, what we need to think about strategically is that a budget's also a moral document, and it translates our district's goals and priorities into tangible financial decisions that affect students and the community. So we need to be able to triangulate around our board's goals, the priorities that we've established as a district, and the individual strategies, for example, or actions within our LCAP goals that really build a sound budget that link back to those overall organizational outcomes. And what I always love to hear from superintendents and former leaders is, from your own perspective, how have you been able to guide some of those conversations around linking the idea of dollars and cents and accounts and amounts to some of those bigger strategic goals or priorities that you might have had?
Well, I mean, I think number one, it's how do you engage your community to keep them informed, and all your stakeholders. So I think having those opportunities where you're presenting this and sharing this with them on a regular, ongoing basis, and not making budget this mystery that happens in some dark room and you're crunching numbers and those kind of things, and then ultimately being able to show how your budget aligns to these goals and actions, and where the spending is aligned to that. And I think about this is, if our number one strategic goal is around increasing student academic achievement, then our expenditures should be primarily going towards that. And sometimes I think maybe that isn't always the case, and we end up getting drawn into other areas based upon sometimes crisis, maybe even lack of planning. There's a number of nuances that can drive that, but that's what I really think is, how can you create this transparency? How can you engage your community? It is one of the things that I have enjoyed about when I was a superintendent, the LCAP process. It is a lot of work, but you get stakeholders engaged in that process. They drive your priorities. They tell you, what are the things that you should be focusing on. And then ultimately, though, how are you connecting those dollars, and then what is it leading to in terms of outcomes in the end?
Yeah, and that's critical, right? Especially when we talk about being able to have an informed public or being able to have some of those difficult conversations when we are thinking about just purely the dollars and cents and needing to balance. But how do we systematically implement a framework to really think critically around those goals and actions from LCAP, for example, back into eventually how we're choosing to invest our dollars, and then how does that meaningfully affect change or improve outcomes?
And I think one
And
of the things, Tyler, here that also we got to be careful that we don't get caught in this edu speak when we're having conversations, and then also we're not just driven by numbers. I think about a SACS report that doesn't do us a lot of good. So we've got to make it in plain language, digestible for people. Again, even in terms of our goals and actions, plain language so people to understand, outcomes tied to that, and then again, in terms of the dollars, making it easily digestible for folks to understand what's actually happening.
yeah, I was actually just speaking with a district in Southern California earlier this week, and we were looking at their website and talking about some of the financial information that they display. And there was a GL, or an account ledger report, for every single building in there. It was hundreds and hundreds of pages, purely just accounts with dollars.
Yeah.
And we kind of had the conversation around, so what? Like, you've done that, you've checked off the transparency box, but is anyone doing anything meaningful with that? And honestly, if somebody got to page 70 of that and wanted to talk to me, I might be afraid, because really they might have a bone to pick. So I think really what we want to think about is district strategy needs to be backed by what we would call a resource allocation plan. And when we look at different artifacts out there and best practices, even from things or organizations like FICMAT, we know that resource allocations need to inform budget development. And so what do we mean by that? And really what we want to talk about is, from a resource perspective, it can be things like time, your staff, technology, money. I'm always thinking about food, but right, how do we motivate staff? Maybe a pizza party, maybe actually doing something pretty neat. But what we want to do is think about the allocation of resources as the process for distributing available goods and services in a way that aligns with those goals. So even from a macro level, when I think about resource allocations, it could be decisions around class size. A resource allocation decision is a ratio. So that could be something like, let's implement a ratio for grades K through 3 at class size of 28. If we want to talk about decreasing average class size down to 21, that is a resource allocation decision before we even get to accounts and amounts and the brass tacks of a budget. On the flip side, we might also talk about, from a professional development standpoint, that we want to increase our allocation for professional development by 20% next year, because we know that there are key things that are affecting our teachers, and we want to invest more to make sure that we're targeting appropriate PD to those teachers that need it most. But when we talk about really resource allocation decisions, it's those bigger picture pieces that we want to then inform budget. And it can be really hard for finance people to get out of the weeds at times, to think at a high level about some of those and really start to create systems around them. Jeff, from your perspective, from resource allocations, you and I talk a lot about staffing and staff modeling, and ultimately the intersection of enrollment forecasts with what we should be doing in terms of projected staff numbers. But when you were at Newhall, or when you were at any of your other districts, what were conversations around resource allocations like for you?
Well, it's interesting because I think sometimes you think, well, let's just change. It's simple. Let's go from 28 to 24, 28 to 20. And the reality is being able to have that be transparent so that you can actually see what the impact of that is in action. Was, when I was there, wasn't as easy to do because it was done on another spreadsheet. It was here, you couldn't really see that, I would call it scenario planning. So if you're looking at adjusting this, or you want to add a counselor, maybe you're going to add assistant principals at your Title I school sites, those kind of things. Generally, that was not easy to do when we're sitting at a cabinet, maybe in a cabinet meeting, we're having these conversations, or maybe we're even in a closed session with board, in a closed session board meeting, and we're talking about different nuances, or we're going to add this piece to it. So I think when you really talk about the allocation of resources, I think the challenge is the ability to be able to do that in real time and understand what that could look like and create scenario planning from that moving forward.
Absolutely. And really at the end of the day for us, I think when we talk about resource allocation plans is that it provides us an objective framework to really make those decisions. What are we going to invest in, sunset, or continue to maintain, and then manage the consequences of those decisions. And that's where, again, what we find when districts end up in hot water is that if we're not thinking at that high level first around some of the bigger impacts from a resource allocation perspective, we get stuck in that cycle of trying to balance the budget, keeping everything that we had. And then it's pretty easy, honestly, to end up in the paper, to end up over budget or over leveraged, or really failing to implement or innovate and do things new. And I think that's so critical as we start to talk to districts. And that's something that I've observed as we go through and evaluate whether or not Allovue is a usable solution for districts. It's really starting to ground and think about, well, what's a resource allocation plan? Do you have one? And really, what does that mean? So when we talk with districts, we'll often say, do you have a resource allocation plan or a funding formula? And depending on the persona or the person that we talk to, the first answer might be no. But when you start to peel back and ask questions, what we realize is that really a lot of districts do have these resource allocation plans or funding formulas. They might not just necessarily live in finance. They could live in HR. They might live in special ed. We might see grants choosing how to make allocation decisions. But when we talk to districts, we see things like teacher contracts, for example, that mandate class size ratios. That's probably the most basic and in your face example of a resource allocation plan or decision. We talk about mandating average class sizes from bond levies. We've seen things around business rules to carry forward budget amounts, or even to think about how do we make adjustments for utilities for inflation, for example. When we look at how programs are distributed across schools, and we know that there are certain staff that are targeted towards those particular programs or initiatives, those are all resource allocation plans or decisions. And by implementing those frameworks, we're then able to adapt to changing conditions within the district. So a good example of that being, how are interventionists allocated across the district? Is it one per building? Do some buildings have more? There are implicit rules behind the scenes that even people in ed services will hold on to indirectly, but those are all part of a funding formula or resource allocation plan. And we really need mechanisms or ways to bring those all to the forefront so that everyone is looking at those through a single pane of glass to really get the full picture of not only what their data is telling them, but the information that, from the outputs and how to make some of those bigger decisions. And so, I think again, as you've gotten to, talk with so many districts, today, what's some of that conversation been like, and even sitting on calls with me around some of those resource allocation plans or decisions?
Well, I mean, I think you brought up an interesting one in today's era as we're trying to, move forward and mitigate the learning loss. And you think about intervention teachers, or you think about counselors. I alluded to that earlier, the need for additional behavioral support. And so, what kind of was the challenge, I think, was, maybe you want to differentiate what that model is going to look like for a Title I site versus a non-Title I site, or there's a site that has more needs, not even a Title I site that has greater needs than the next Title I site, and really looking at what that resource allocation was going to look like, and then really be able to cost that out or understand the scenario planning behind that. That was a challenge, quite frankly, and wasn't something that was easily had in terms of a conversation. And it would be like, okay, we got to go back and do this. But in this tool, you can really start making those adjustments on the fly, build the logic behind all of that, and really have these in-depth conversations, as a cabinet level team, conversations with a governing board members as well around what makes sense around that resource allocation.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've talked about it a lot. Well, what happens is we start to layer in the uncertainty associated with enrollment. We know what our current average class size are, our target ratios. We also know approximately how much particular job titles or types cost. So why can't we start to evaluate and model some of those differences? So as enrollment continues to fluctuate, if we want to do things like change a class size ratio, and how does collective bargaining layer into that to affect our full district's budget picture? And I think, there was a CFO in Oregon actually that I think coined it pretty well, and it was the budget is a pie and not a well. And so we need to be able to really systematically approach some of these big decisions so that it doesn't feel like a chainsaw approach when we are making some of these bigger decisions around our budget. So really having that full picture in place allows us, again, to make really difficult decisions. And then we, again, have to think about managing the consequences of those decisions. And that's really what we start to think about when we relate to the optics of budget. So, there's two components that I think about, sort of were really near and dear to my heart when I was at my district. The first was internal communication and alignment around budget. We need to be able to make sure that even if the people don't like the decisions that are being made, which might be we have to make a reduction or you do not get that new thing next year, but we need to make sure that we're all in alignment around the same page around how those decisions were made. And as we build that internal alignment and understanding around those decision points, how do we start to communicate those externally in a way that's meaningful? So in my own personal example of that, in one of the last years I was at my district, there was a conversation in a community grassroots campaign that said 2 miles is too far. And that had to do with our busing radius around our high schools. So a community group got together, and actually it was a social studies teacher at one of our high schools that helped a bunch of kids start this advocacy campaign to reduce the busing radius from 2 miles down to a mile. We knew in finance that was going to total something like a $3.8 million increase in our annual operating budget, which we had no money for at the time. And we needed to come up with mechanisms for learning how to, and teaching people that really the impacts of some of those, budget changes. And it was a long, drawn out process. We had to talk a lot internally around some of those decisions. So if this is an add to our budget, what are some of the things that could possibly come out? The just cut central office narrative didn't really work on that one, even though that's what had been pushed. And then we had to think about how do we go through and communicate not only to our board, but to the media and the public around why or why not we might be able to make some of those decisions. And we were able to handle it in a way that was sustainable, and we built a lot of understanding around why we were resource constrained that really helped, I think, everybody become more comfortable. But really, when we talk about budget today, they're in the news, they're everywhere. Everybody likes a good headline, especially if it's negative. They want the 30-second soundbite, but really it's a 7-minute long answer. And so, being able to be out in front of some of those conversations and convey messages that are consistent, no matter who we're talking to, that are meaningful to the people that we're communicating them, can be incredibly important as we start to move forward. And, again, from your perspective, I'm sure you've lost sleep over the thought of budget conversations hitting the paper, and I'm sure many of the people that are on this call today as well have been experiencing those in real time. And it's the realities of finance in the world that we live in today. I don't know if you have any anecdotal experiences or war stories.
Yeah, all I'm just thinking is you just definitely don't want to get to know FICMAT. They're there to support, but I mean, that's the last, and I keep reading headlines even in papers right now where county offices are coming in, holding special board meetings with a school district that's $35 million in the hole, and they got to make cuts. Those are not small pennies when you're talking a district of let's say 10,000 students. $35 million is a huge budget concern. So the belief here is, how do we help plan for that and then engage with your community to make this conversation? It's never going to be easy, but I think maybe it can be more informed moving forward.
Right. And especially from a public trust perspective, when we talk about budget, balancing budget, how do people tend to end up in the news around some of those budget issues? It's establishing trust and communication. And ultimately, we need clear mechanisms to show that we have ownership and that we are providing, an effective education, but also we're dealing with the realities associated with finance. And if we keep our head in the sand for too long when we know that things are coming, we end up in situations again where those budget changes or reductions can seem arbitrary or ugly, and really nobody's on board with those. And I think, again, just to really hit home, when we talk about budget, and the example that I had from the Southern California district is that transparency really does not mean clarity. And again, that's both from an internal perspective and an external perspective. We talk about getting people on the same page around finance. And if I show you that 170,000 row Excel sheet that I live and breathe in every day, that means makes perfect sense to me, it's going to seem like a different language to you. I think probably the worst analogy would be it's like trying to show my mother-in-law how to use a smartphone. She's excited, but as soon as you start to show examples of it, her eyes glaze over and you've already lost them. And that's the same thing that happens around finance data, which I think gets people to leverage some of those quick sound bites that seem convenient, but actually there's a lot more complex problems around the scene, behind the scenes. What are some ways that you've experienced people have started to talk about numbers in maybe a more effective way, or some of the messaging that you've tried around budget to help make things more relatable?
Well, I mean, the thing is, I think the more you can empower in a school district, even your site leaders to be able to engage like their school site councils around the budget and where things are going. I think that's, again, you're trying to educate layers of your community in this. And if it's viewed as everything's done at the district level and there isn't this shared ownership around budgeting and the transparency and the communication within the community. But what I appreciate it, Tyler, on that, when you go back to that last slide and then you go to this, like you're talking a completely different view of what, like this is literally just numbers on a spreadsheet. And then you go to the next one and you can see you've got trend graphs, you've got plain language text, you've got trends over time. That's what I'm just as you're listening here. And as we get into this, these are the things that really allow this conversation to look very, very different in your community than probably what is existing in most communities, not just in California, but honestly across the nation.
Yeah, absolutely. And even just think about from an internal perspective, if, I was your, CBO and I was going to come at you and say, hey, we need to make a 10% reduction across 310, 1000, 2250. Does that mean anything to you? Or are those conversations grounded in, things that are relatable, which actually leads us to a good question for you. And is five a lot? It depends. $5, not so much. $5 for my 8-year-old, it's a lot. 5 dogs running after you in a park, that might be a lot. But really what we want to talk about is there's a book called Making Numbers Count. The author is Carla Starr. I had an opportunity to sit in on a session with her at a conference a number of years ago now. But all of her research centers around the art and science of communicating with numbers. And they've established really that the human brain doesn't have the capacity to really conceptualize numbers beyond 5. So when we start talking in abstract terms, it's hard to get people to relate to those. It's hard to get them to take action to understand the data or really even lean into or really ask the critical questions. And I know that when I was talking with my board, for example, right, there were times where maybe we would spend 35 minutes talking about a $5,000 transfer from instructional supplies to office supplies. And we had almost no conversation around a bond approval for $5 million to replace the roof for the second time at one of our middle schools. And so we talk about really being able to take abstract thoughts or complex numbers and really distill them down into things that are relatable. And when we talk about it, we've got to make sure that if people don't understand the numbers, again, we might as well be speaking a foreign language. So how do we take something like we need 1 million square feet of roofing and translate that into something that is more palatable or relatable to the general public and our community? So an example of that might be we need to replace about 20 football fields worth of roofing because I can mentally conceptualize how much a football field in terms of square footage is or size. So I need 20 of those. Okay. That's a much easier number for me to wrap my head around to then have a conversation with you on versus $1 million. And the same thing goes when we talk about our overall operating budget. I've got $125 million operating budget. 80% of that is personnel. The remaining of that 20% is non-personnel. I'm lost. I don't actually know what that means and I can't relate to it. Have you experienced any components there or just from a communication perspective where maybe, a good message, but the numbers and the concepts fell flat just because of, some of the complexity associated with it?
Well, I think oftentimes I'm just thinking about raises. Like, why can't we just give 5%? Like 5% raise, but then not understanding what 5% translates into. Or on another side, we need to cut 5%. So why can't we just cut X said positions and not understanding that? So I think on either end, it's the understanding that, oh, that doesn't seem like a lot. Or another classic example is you have 10% in your reserve, but not understanding like that gets you 3 weeks of pay. And people not understanding that, oh, that number seems like a lot. You have $7.5 million in your reserve, but not understanding that would cover salary and benefits for 3 weeks.
One of my favorite examples from my own background, I used to get to go meet with students, and we would do sort of a superintendent's cabinet of kids, and every year we talk about the budget. And we'd go, how much does a teacher make? And these kids would throw out wild numbers, no concepts of it. And we would say, well, how big is our district's budget? I think at the time we were about a $450 million operating budget. I'm in Syracuse, New York, so we had the Carrier Dome. We're like, all right, you've all been to the Dome. You've all seen Syracuse basketball lose. You're all too young to remember the good old days. But you can picture how many people are in there. Now picture 450 million. That would be like buying everybody in the Dome a brand new Honda Civic. And you could see the light bulb start to click. And it was starting to bring these complex numbers back down into terms that were relevant, because what we want people to do is ultimately make them care about it. So we need to make it simple. We need to make them care. And then we need to show them how to do it, or a call to action. So one specific example of that might be, it cost $125,000. It's a new contract, versus this will impact every fourth and fifth grade student if this is implemented at 1/3 of our elementary schools. That is a much different weight in terms of cause and effect, in terms of the quantity, in terms of really the messaging around that budget. Because again, if people are focused on, the things that they can relate to, how do we take these complex concepts and really distill them down so that people can actually take actions or understand the things that we need them to help move the district forward? And that can be really such a challenge, no matter whether it be I go to a new department head and start talking to them about some of the changes we might need to make from a budget perspective, or talk about staffing ratios at a school and having some of those difficult conversations around right sizing staff so that we can do things in other buildings, or again, help balance our budget. But we need to make sure that whatever we're doing from a communication perspective in budget, that we're grounding it in sort of these core principles so that people can make actions that are informed and not just arbitrary, or they plead ignorance when they don't make a decision because it was too complex. Those are the things that are indicative of getting us into hot water, or really setting us up for potentially some issues farther down the road from a budget perspective, or just that financial optics.
Yeah.
And what I want to do is think a little bit more even outside of finance with you, Jeff. And we talk a lot about data points, from whether it be ratios, enrollment counts. We talk about dollars and cents related to specific programs or investments. We know that there's really any number of ways that you can slice and dice, data. Give me a big cup of coffee and I'll play with whatever spreadsheet and make whatever pivot table you need to help tell your story. But on the flip side of that, really, they don't always necessarily tell the whole story. So, from your own experience and what you think about education finance data, what are some other data points that you think help build really that holistic picture around budget and some of the investments and priorities that we're making as districts?
Well, I mean, I think, in California, you're looking at attendance data, because that's obviously driving your revenue in your district. I think you're wanting to make sure that the dollars and cents that you're spending are actually impacting student outcomes, whether that be academic, behavioral. You want to look at your community engagement, how engaged is your family, and what does that look like at your different sites? Because I think you're trying to get this holistic picture of, are the dollars and cents impacting and moving the needle in the direction that you want, that is aligned based upon your strategic goals and actions that you have in place.
Yeah, and I think you and I were at a conference over the summer, and one of the leading themes there, we are data rich but information poor.
Yep.
And, being able to connect some of those dots to really tell that impactful story or compelling story to either justify some of the expenditures and investments we're making, to think strategically around what we need to do to continue to innovate or move forward, or ultimately just help balance our budget. We've got to look at, that ecosystem of data outside of even just the dollars and cents to really, really dig down and make a keen understanding of what it is we have. I think I've talked about it before, but one of the big analyses, for example, that I had looked at and underdone at my district, it was the idea of cost of failure at high school. And we were looking at gatekeeper courses, so algebra, and we were looking at repeat sections. So we knew how many teachers taught algebra. We looked at the total number of new incoming ninth graders that would be taking it, as well as on the flip side of that, the number of kids that were repeating. I think we had identified something like 14 teachers and 6 sections per teacher that were purely just teaching repeating sections. So that's staff really that are doing their job again. So how do we think about justifying additional interventions to help reduce that cost of failure so that we can potentially free ourselves up to do different things? And that's the type of information that can be so hard to really pinpoint and hone in on to make some of those decisions. But that's ultimately where even creating frameworks around resource allocation decisions gives us that guiding framework to even start asking those questions so that we're not just thinking about, here's the staff I had, here's what I'm going to have next year, and here's playing with the margins on contract services to balance the budget. It's really that holistic approach from a number of different data sources to help inform some of that decision making. And I think what we'll do next, and we've talked in sort of abstract for a little while. What I want to do is start off and talk a little bit about how does Allovue create some of those resource allocation frameworks and build ownership and really clarity around finance to not only our internal stakeholders around budget, but also externally when we start to communicate out our plans to, for example, our board. And so the easiest way to do that is to think about from a day in the life perspective, if I am a principal at a building. So when we talk about translating things like accounts and amounts, when I go start to talk to a department head or a principal around their finances, I might talk to them about what they're investing in so far this year in Title I. It's not a conversation around accounts. It's not a conversation around amounts. It is a clear view into the data that allows us to understand that I have $349,000 remaining, for example. And if I want to get keen and clear understandings of what I've purchased or what I've done with the staff that I have, I'm able to do that really very quickly within our tool, for example, to get an understanding of that data. The beauty of this is that it integrates with any ERP system, so your district's financial system, and this essentially sits on top and acts as a system of insight. Your system of record still remains intact. So I'm going to get clear views into all of my financial data to really understand what I'm allowed to use funds for. Is it an acceptable use of funds? Have I done things like always left money on the table and never quite spent those resources down? Or is it, I'm always a little bit over budget or pushing close to the margins? Maybe we need to think about repurposing some of these existing funds, but it allows us, again, to really get that holistic view. And especially in California, when we talk about those tighter relationships between ed services and finance and LCAP, one of the things that we often see, for example, is silos around who is covering what on which budget. And specifically, I mean things like our Title I resources versus what might be, on our unrestricted funds, on the general fund. And I've seen that time and time again, where somebody that's budgeting for general fund instruction ultimately somehow budgeted for it on title or a grant, and we've now got it budgeted in 2 places. And we've now miraculously got funds in the middle of the year. But those are the types of spending behaviors we want to try to prevent. And we do that through providing clear and transparent information that's easy to understand. And that's just so critical, even just as a fundamental building block for everyone in the district when we start talking about finance.
And I'll just give you an example. So I can remember when I started in Newhall as an assistant superintendent of educational services. LCFF was just coming in. The district had made the decision that LCFF funds supplemental funds could not be carried over, but Title I funds could. So lo and behold, the year wraps up. I knew what I had left in Title I funds at the district office. July rolls around. It's like the middle of July. We run a report. And guess what? Of course, the site spent every dime of their supplemental, but what happened is our carryover now, this is middle of July, was now sitting at 31% for Title I. I had 6 weeks to create a plan, which we were able to do. We used the funds wisely. We made a good investment in some training for our teachers around math. But that was an example. This would have never happened had I had this picture, because I would have known what my funds were and I would be able to see what every site's funds were. And we could look at this honestly on a monthly basis as a cabinet and see that trend data.
One of the things that I always find interesting, especially when we talk to districts, is when we look at trend lines, for example, around spending. Are you using this year's dollars for this year's kids? And so many times when we look at spending performance or budget performance, those lines might stay flat until the last 2 weeks before a purchasing deadline, and then they drop off. Everybody complains about purchasing taking too long. But what really happened was people thought they were being good stewards of their dollars by hanging on to them and thinking strategically about it and then doing all their orders at the end so that they could get it in the summer for next year, versus flipping that script and being more proactive throughout the year on some of those spend rates so that we aren't reacting at the end. And I've seen districts buy tens of thousands of dollars worth of crayons because a pre-K grant was ending, for example. So we end up with sort of these funny.
My favorite principal, Tim, ordering $80,000 in Chromebooks every April.
Yeah.
Those conversations become different when you have this graphical representation.
Yep. Yeah, we saw it with a district recently, actually, in Central California, and they ended up buying, I think, brand new laptops for all of their special ed teachers because they were looking at their maintenance of effort and what was going on in the balance between general fund special ed spending and what they were doing on IDEA. And they realized very quickly that they needed to spend some extra money because they had had so many vacancies that they hadn't been able to fill, and they had just a ton of salary breakage. But yeah, all sorts of ineffectual spending behaviors that can result. But I think, building some of those fundamental financial literacy components and that internal clarity piece allows us to then to start having more difficult or productive conversations during budget. And so when we think about creating budget, it's not, I had $10,000 last year, I need $11,000 this year. We need to really think strategically around the things we need. And from a resource allocation perspective, before I ever go in and talk with a budget owner or a cabinet about accounts and amounts and dollars and cents, I want to think about those allocated resources that have been established across the district based on our business rules. So let's go in and start to evaluate, for example, what we projected for your enrollment for next year. For example, that at your building, it's, you've got relatively low poverty, you're an elementary school, and we want to start seeing how all of our different rules apply then to some of the decisions that we're going to make. I know that you're going to get 2 assistant principals next year based on a predetermined ratio that we have. That is not a black box. That's not buried on page 187 in our collective bargaining agreement. That is explicitly laid out how that works. We want to think about the staff that we're projecting for your building based on that enrollment. Maybe we want to start to identify things like staffing ratios and all of those other pieces that we know to be true. But really, how do we take all of those things or resource allocation decisions, translate them into plain language for everyone internally to understand, so that when I need to make a decision around budget, I've got both the historical context and the current year finance information leveraged. And now I know from a top level, the resource allocations that are going to be made and how those ultimately need to come together as part of a budget plan. And this is a piece that, again, when we talk about demystifying finance or creating systems that are adaptable to change, it's really that intersection of our business rules with known variables that allow us to start to create sort of that blueprint or plan for how we need to implement our budget. And this is where, again, we see districts getting into hot water, where even if it might show potentially a staffing adjustment or a reduction, we need to think about what that actually might look like. And maybe we, defer some of those changes, but ultimately maybe we know we need to make some of those hard decisions and right size staff at certain locations or redistribute staff across the district. And again, even if we're jumping into then how do we take that and apply a budget, there's a number of other pieces to get into, but Jeff, it looks like you're about to say something there, because again, we spent a lot of time talking about this, but from your lens, what does that look like?
Well, I mean, I think this can even be from like a student services lens as they're building out allocations for SDC classroom, psychologist, all of those kind of things can really, so what I like about this is I think it creates this collaboration opportunity to really engage. And you create these standards, and then from there, obviously there are times where you don't split kids in half, you don't split personnel in half, so you have to make those decisions. But I think it really shifts this process to being more collaborative across departments. And then also even in collaboration potentially with your site administrators around what they're thinking to allocate moving forward.
Yeah, and that comes to mind. I'd heard a superintendent say it at one point, and it was, "Your crisis might not be my priority." And that's where, when we're dealing with, any number of competing interests across our district, we need to understand, how does the initial framework work? And then as we start to layer in changes, maybe it's a budget proposal for something like a new curriculum pilot. We want to be able to apply things like dollars and cents and really think strategically around the types of resources that we're going to invest in. So when we talk to people in terms of getting good data, creating those resilient budgeting processes, I might want you to tell me not so much about an account, but I want you to tell me the stuff and things you need. And I want to give you an opportunity to not only give me a justification for that, but I also want you to tie that back to our goals and actions during budget development, not as an ad hoc process at the last minute before we have to do our reporting. And so that's where, again, we think it's critical as we start to say, well, what resources do you have available? What do you want to do with those resources? We want to empower you to make those decisions, and then build that together into a cohesive budget. And, again, we see that time and time again as we start to talk with the people that are exploring how do we create some of these more resilient frameworks around budget. A lot of it starts with flipping that culture and narrative, that it is not just a rollover budget. It's not flicking pennies off the rail when we need to make some of the reductions, but it's really thinking about the stuff. The accounting information follows, but we need to bring those together, again, from creating that strategic lens around resource allocations and strategic budgeting, away from some of those normal things that we do when we're comfortable or in a reactive state. And, I'm sure that would have probably helped you in a number of different instances, starting to talk about budget, not just in terms of contract services, but the investments that we want to make.
Yeah.
And as we start to go through and approve a budget, we want to think about then the optics from an external, budget lens. So as our districts go through and we think about budget development, we also want to talk about, well, what is that budget going to look like from the perspective of an end user or the community as we're starting to interact with our budget? And so one of the pieces that we think is fundamentally important to that is thinking about, how do we communicate our budget externally? And so if we know that transparency does not necessarily mean clarity, if we know that we need to have concrete resource allocation plans embedded as part of our budget process, we need to outline and explain those things in plain and clear language and clear terms to the public. So one of the things that we're really excited that we've done is create a budget book that we can publish directly within your website. So for example, if I'm going to do the hard work of budget, maybe now we want to start to talk about some of those key messages that are affecting us, and really start to position, some of the big difficult decisions or resource allocation decisions that we've been making. So if it's talking about some of those key areas that we want to choose to invest in, these are the things that I want people to understand, not necessarily all those accounts and amounts in the background, but we really want to be able to highlight and call out some of those strategic investments and the things that are most important to us, and do it in a way that's impactful. I went through the GFOA budget book development process at my district, and one of the things that I had done, the first, I think, 8 pages of my budget book were awards and recognitions from, some of the bigger professional services organizations, but that doesn't necessarily actually mean anything to anyone that wants to look at it. So from a modern K-12 lens, and really providing that clarity, what we want to do is be able to populate that and call it out and put it out in front of your face, so that we can effectively have, message around that budget, and people are getting the information that they need. And Jeff, from your own lens, from a budget book perspective, do you think it's reasonable for someone to go pour through 700 pages of a book, or would you prefer to have something that's out in front of your face? And that is clearly a loaded question.
Yeah, I know. And I even think about some of the stuff that I even asked my CBO to create to try to simplify things. And there was tons of time that they spent in doing this kind of work to make it more transparent. And when this can be done for us through this resource, I just think it's a ton of time saving for staff internally and a great resource for families.
Yeah, and especially even if we're starting to talk about, well, what does a staffing ratio look like, or how do we make some of those resource allocation decisions? What I think we find incredibly impactful is being able to say, well, if we start to evaluate different scenarios, what's going to happen? Maybe we're projecting a significant decline in enrollment. Maybe we want to identify what our per pupil investments are. Or maybe we want to look at the total impact of a budget associated with a policy change. And that's where having a unified tool to do that really makes some of these conversations much more transparent and much more clear to the people that ultimately are going to be affected by some of those choices. Again, that could be just getting into the nitty gritty and saying, this is what's going to happen if we cut average class size. Here's what's going to happen if we increase it in grades 4 through 5. Any of those bigger decisions, we want to be able to call those out explicitly. And I think sort of as a takeaway, as we start to wind down our time here, Jeff, there's some pretty big takeaways when we start to really think systematically around the strategic differences that go into budget development. And those are the ideas, for example, that district strategy, again, has to be backed by a resource allocation plan. And if you don't, you really don't have a district strategy. We also know that those strategies make it easier for us to adapt to those financial constraints, manage political pressures associated with some of those changes, and ultimately influence stakeholders, as well as giving us that framework, again, holistically to make those decisions and manage the consequences that are a result of those. Anything that you'd like to add there just from your own lens?
I mean, I just, the one thing I'll just say, and when I think about the opportunity that a solution like this provides, a school district is, I mean, number one, it's going to save time ultimately for your financial department, because generally what's happening is when you're a site principal or you're leading a district department, oftentimes you're emailing back to the financial department, what can you get me in terms of my current budget, where I'm at, and the numbers are not even current because there are things that are still being processed. So I think it's going to save a lot of time internally. I think it's going to create this opportunity to be transparent in the process. And again, I highlighted the collaboration process around the budgeting piece. I think it shifts what that looks like. And then in terms of the allocation modeling, the scenario that I always think about is even when you're in potentially with negotiations and you're sitting at the table and there's a list of requests that come from that bargaining group. I see it right now where you could put all of those requests into that model, a model based upon the request. And then you'll see that if you enter all of those things that are being requested in that third out year, you're going to be negative $15 million in the hole. It's just going to change the conversation around negotiations around what's real, what's not real, or can you just cut 5 people from the central office and realize that really didn't impact the budget because 4 of those 5 people were funded by grants or federal funds. So I just think it's a narrative to shift the work that's happening inside of school districts.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree with you more there. And right, again, do you have a funding formula? Do you have a resource allocation plan? Most districts, if that is not at the forefront of their mind, right, there's potential there for inconsistency, but that's really what we want to call home. And so, again, a budget is more than accounts and amounts. You need to move beyond some of those incremental adjustments and tendencies to want to roll over and really think about those strategic resource allocation decisions. We need to make sure that clear and understandable data, and when we're making numbers count, actually affects stakeholder influence. So we need to make sure that we're clear in our messaging, and we need to make sure that budgeting is a year-round process and it's not a set and forget or just that simple, one time a year thing, but really taking that long range picture into some of those bigger decisions to make sure that we're doing the right things for our kids and we're balancing that with the known realities associated with our funding constraints.
I think we're done, James.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, a lot of good information. I haven't seen any questions come through, but we can give a little bit of time for that. But I guess Tyler, Jeff, like just me being kind of new in this with Power School, obviously we're a partner, we've worked together. But tell me, what are the things like typical questions that are asked that this folks should be aware about? If there's anything that come to your mind that you typically get, how do I get this started? To who manages it? Like, what are the questions that you typically get? This to kind of address, if you guys don't mind.
Tyler, I'll let you tackle the logistics.
Yeah. So, when we talk about budget development or tools like Allovue within the Power School umbrella, how do we utilize those? Typically there's different values and different ways that someone like a superintendent or a CBO or our ed services team is going to interact with that. So we need concrete financial data from a CFO perspective or CBO perspective. And that's where some of the implementation work comes in on Allovue. But there's a lot of strategic work and partnership that happens then between ed services and human resources and really all the other internal stakeholders. And that's where Allovue shines, because we're again taking that data that is in an ERP system as our system of record or ratios that exist in other departments and bringing those all together into one unified place to really help make some of those decisions. So as we start to evaluate and get started, a lot of the conversation is around, well, what are you doing from a budget perspective today? Are there things or challenges that you run into, whether it be running into deficits or having to make some hard decisions? Sort of what are the impacts associated with those decisions? So we really like to think even from that ground level around how are resource allocation decisions formally embedded as part of that budget process, which we know is best practice and needs to happen, but then ultimately have a resilient budget process that's adaptable to change.
Got it. I'll give it a few more seconds here for any other questions, or Jeff.
The other thing, James, I would just say is, Tyler highlighted 3 components of the Allovue suite. So there's budget, manage, and allocation. I think I got those 3 right. And again, you don't have to choose all 3. You could start with one, and some start with only manage because that's going to impact the principals and the district office. It just varies from district to district, or even potentially, county office or things like that. So those are really decisions that the district can make moving forward. And obviously, depending upon if you go with one piece or all 3, the implementation time varies for those. But it's pretty manageable. I'll just say this, in terms of a lot of solutions that I've implemented, the implementation cycle of this is pretty darn good, and the implementation goes very, very well. Lots of really positive feedback.
Yeah, it takes on average about 3 months to get this off the ground and running. We work with districts that use Focus, Galaxy, and other ERP systems, PeopleSoft, for example. And really what we want to do is translate that accounting information into plain language and get people to understand that data. And that's where we really shine as an organization.
Got it. And there was a question, will there be a copy of the webinar? Yes, there will be. We'll be sending that out through our communications department. Is there anything else that you guys want to add before I close here today? I know we're a little bit over time, but everything was very, very, very helpful. I guess one question I would have, just new, cost. I mean, are you guys like what competitors, like when I'm looking at this, what your system costs? Is there things I should be thinking of when I go talk to my folks in my district I should be aware of, or how does that typically work?
Pricing typically works on a per pupil basis, and it depends on the district and what you're interested in investing in. So, different components have different costs associated with those. But ultimately, the things to be looking for, in terms of value and how we're going to use something like Allovue, how do we make some of those difficult budget decisions? And really the quality of those decisions and the frameworks that we're putting in place, we need to make sure that we're setting ourselves up for success. And that's where, again, even just that anecdotal example of finding a grant that was, or a contract that was budgeted on a grant and on the general fund, being able to really turn on the light switch in a room versus looking around with a flashlight that allows districts to really realize savings and understand, what they need to be investing in.
Got it. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. And thank you for our presenters, Jeff and Tyler. You guys were great today. We really appreciate your time and your effort of putting things together. It was very clear, it was very concise, and we're very appreciative of that.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
Yep, CSBA is dedicated to providing up-to-date resources and school board members. To view our recent webinars, be sure to check out our YouTube page at youtube.com/CSBA video, video. If you are interested in attending future CSBA webinars, please go to our website at www.csba.org/webinars to register for upcoming webinars. Many thanks to our presenters. With that, thank you guys and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Take care.